Whispers filled the small frontier church as Sarah Whitman stood alone at the altar, her carefully chosen wedding dress now a symbol of rejection rather than joy. At 45, she had traveled 2,000 miles west, carrying hope in her heart and promises in letters. But when her intended groom saw her age-lined face, he turned away with cruel words that echoed through the wooden pews. The townspeople's pitying glances cut deeper than the morning frost. That's when Thomas Henderson rose from the back row, his calloused hands steady on his well-worn hat. This quiet cowboy had nothing to his name but a small ranch and an honest heart. What made this humble man step forward when others stepped back? What did he see that the wealthy rancher couldn't? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months earlier, Sarah Whitman sat in her Boston boarding house room, carefully untying the ribbon that bound together 6 months of correspondence. Each letter, written in James Montgomery's precise hand, spoke of prosperity, kindness, and the promise of a fresh start in Montana territory. The paper was expensive, the penmanship refined, all suggesting a man of means and education. She traced her fingers over his latest letter, remembering how her heart had quickened at his words. Age is but a number, my dear Miss Whitman. What matters most is the wisdom and grace that comes with life's experiences. The sentiment had moved her deeply, especially after years of feeling invisible in a city where youth seemed the only currency worth trading in. Sarah had never planned on becoming a mail-order bride. For 20 years she'd worked as a seamstress in one of Boston's finest shops, creating wedding gowns for younger women, while her own dreams of marriage gathered dust like the spools of thread that lined her workroom shelves. The war had taken so many men of her generation, and the years that followed had seen most of her friends either wed or resigned to spinsterhood. The advertisement in the newspaper had caught her eye one gray morning. Successful Montana rancher seeks educated, mature lady for marriage, must appreciate the finer things in life and be willing to help manage a thriving cattle operation. It was the word mature that had made her pause, tea cooling forgotten beside her morning paper. Her first letter to James had been cautious, honest about her age and circumstances. His reply had been swift and encouraging, speaking of shared values and similar backgrounds. He wrote of his large ranch house with its library full of books, of evening conversations over fine wine, of the respect he'd earned in the growing town of Silver Creek. I find myself drawn to your quiet dignity, he'd written in his third letter. Your description of the satisfaction you take in creating beautiful things speaks to a refined soul. Sarah had pressed that letter to her heart, hope blooming like the first flowers of spring. Over the months that followed, she'd sewn her own wedding dress during the quiet evenings, putting all her skill into every stitch. The cream-colored silk was simple but elegant, suited to a woman of her years. In her mind, she'd pictured wearing it as she descended from the stagecoach to meet James, imagined his kind smile as he took her hand. The reality of Silver Creek had been different from the moment she arrived. The town was smaller than his letters had suggested, the streets more mud than proper roads. Still, Sarah had held onto her optimism even when no one came to meet her at the stage stop. She'd made her way to the hotel on foot, her carpet bag heavy with letters and dreams. It was only later, after paying for her own room with carefully saved funds, that she'd overheard the whispers. James Montgomery was indeed the richest rancher in the territory, and a man known for his demanding nature. His first wife had left him 2 years earlier, fleeing back east with tales of coldness and cruel criticism. But Sarah had come too far to turn back. Tomorrow morning she would put on her carefully made dress and walk to the church, carrying hope and 6 months of promises bound in faded ribbon. Perhaps the whispers were wrong. Perhaps James Montgomery was exactly the man his letters portrayed. As she folded the last letter and placed it back in its bundle, Sarah caught her reflection in the hotel room's spotted mirror. Yes, there were lines at the corners of her eyes, silver threads in her dark hair. But there was strength there too, earned through years of standing on her own 2 feet. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it with dignity. She blew out the lamp and lay down on the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town settling into night. In her dreams, she danced at her wedding, held secure in arms she had yet to meet, while letters scattered like leaves in an autumn wind. Dawn broke over Silver Creek with the crisp clarity unique to mountain mornings. Sarah stood at her hotel window, holding her mother's silver hand mirror as she pinned her hair in the way she'd practiced back in Boston. The mirror had traveled, west in her carpet bag, carefully wrapped in her best chemise, its tarnished surface reflecting 3 generations of Whitman women on their wedding days. "You're a sight prettier than I was at my wedding," her mother had said, pressing the mirror into Sarah's hands before consumption took her 15 years ago, and I was only 20 then. The memory brought a sad smile to Sarah's lips as she smoothed a stray grey strand back into place. Outside, Silver Creek was stirring to life. A wagon rattled past on the rutted street, and Sarah caught fragments of conversation as 2 women hurried by, their voices carrying clearly through the thin window pane. "Montgomery's bride, arriving today, mail order. At her age? Well, I never—" Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she fastened the last pin, but she lifted her chin, meeting her own gaze in the spotted glass. She had known there would be talk. Small towns ran on gossip like steam engines ran on coal, and she was prepared for the scrutiny. The dress hung ready on the door hook, cream silk catching the morning light. Sarah ran her hands over the careful stitching, each seam a testament to hours of work and hope. The style was deliberately modest, high-necked, with delicate lace at collar and cuffs that she'd salvaged from her mother's wedding gown. A knock at the door startled her. "Miss, it's Mrs. Bailey, the innkeeper's wife." Sarah opened the door, to find a plump woman with kind eyes holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Thought you might want these for your bouquet, being new in town and all. They're just from my garden. Nothing fancy." The simple gesture brought unexpected tears to Sarah's eyes. "They're perfect, Mrs. Bailey. Thank you. Need help with your dress? Can't have you walking to church alone on your wedding day." Sarah accepted gratefully, and soon Mrs. Bailey's practiced hands were fastening the long row of buttons down her back. The older woman's chatter filled the room with comfortable normalcy. "There now, you look every inch a bride, and don't you mind what anyone says about your age. My sister Mary didn't marry till she was 43, and she's got the happiest marriage in Denver." Sarah smiled at the obvious attempt at reassurance. "Mr. Montgomery's letters suggest he's not concerned about such things." Something flickered in Mrs. Bailey's expression, quickly hidden. "Well then, shall we get you to the church? It's not far, just past the Mercantile." They stepped out into the morning sunshine, Sarah's cream silk dress drawing curious looks from passers-by. The church sat on a small rise at the edge of town, its white-painted boards gleaming against the backdrop of distant mountains. Sarah paused at the bottom of the steps, taking a deep breath of thin mountain air. Mrs. Bailey squeezed her arm. "Remember, dear, you've as much right to happiness as any young girl." Sarah nodded, straightened her shoulders, and began to climb the church steps. The sound of her footsteps on the wooden boards seemed to echo with finality, marking each step toward her new life. Her mother's mirror, tucked safely in her pocket, pressed against her hip like a talisman. The church was already half full, curious townsfolk turning to stare as she entered. Sarah kept her eyes forward, focusing on the simple wooden cross above the altar. She had made her choice, traveled 2,000 miles to be here. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through all the lonely years in Boston. From the back of the church came the sound of boots on floorboards, heavy steps that must belong to James Montgomery, the man whose letters had brought her to this moment. Sarah took another deep breath, squared her shoulders, and turned to face her future. Thomas Henderson woke before sunrise, as he had every day for the past 15 years since claiming his modest patch of Montana territory. The ranch's worn ledger lay open on his kitchen table where he'd left it the night before, its pages telling. A story of careful management and honest work, if not prosperity. He lit the lamp and studied the columns of neat figures one more time. The spring calving had gone well, but feed prices were rising, and the new fence line had cost more than expected. Still, there was enough to keep going, enough to stay honest. Thomas had learned long ago that a man could live contentedly on, far less than most people thought they needed. The coffee pot bubbled on the wood stove while he pulled on his good shirt, the one he kept for Sundays and special occasions. It was another beautiful morning, the kind that made him grateful for his small place in the world, even if he shared it with no one but his horse and a few head of cattle. His mother's Bible sat in its usual place by his chair, and he opened it carefully, mindful of the loose pages. Inside the cover, written in his mother's flowing hand, was the family history. Births, deaths, and marriages, stretching back 3 generations. The last entry was his parents' passing, written in his own cramped script. 8 years now, and still no wedding date to add beside his name. Not that he hadn't thought about it. At 48, Thomas was well aware of his solitary state. But life had its own rhythm out here, and he'd never been one to force things. His mother used to say, "The good Lord's got his own timing, Tommy. Best not to rush it." The ledger caught his eye again as he finished his coffee. Feed costs aside, he was doing all right, enough to support a family if it ever came to that. The thought surprised him. It had been years since he'd considered such possibilities. He saddled his horse with practiced ease, the leather creaking comfortably in the morning quiet. Sunday service wasn't for hours yet, but Thomas liked to ride the fence line before church. It was his way of taking stock, not just of his property, but of his life. The rising sun painted the mountains gold as he rode, casting long shadows across his modest spread. 50 acres. Not much compared to the big ranches, but it was paid for, and every acre had been worked by his own hands. The new fence gleamed with fresh wire, and the spring grass was coming in thick and green. A meadowlark's song carried across the valley, and Thomas smiled, remembering how his mother used to say it was God's way of making sure no one felt lonely out here. She'd understood him, known that his quiet nature wasn't from lack of feeling, but from feeling things perhaps too deeply. Near the creek, he dismounted to check a loose post. The morning dew had soaked the grass, and his church boots would need a good cleaning before service. Still, there was something satisfying about doing the work first, about coming to church with honest dirt on your hands. His thoughts turned to James Montgomery's upcoming wedding. The whole town had been talking about it, Montgomery's mail-order bride arriving from back east. Thomas had his own opinions about Montgomery, formed over years of watching the man's dealings with others, but he kept them to himself. It wasn't his place to judge. He'd seen Montgomery's first wife leave 2 years ago, seen her face as she climbed into the eastbound stage. Some hurts went deeper than words could tell, and Thomas had recognized something in her eyes that reminded him of wounded animals he'd found on his land, that look of having trusted unwisely and paid the price. The sun was well up by the time. He turned back toward his cabin. He'd need to clean up, put on his good jacket, the one that hung a bit loose now after the long winter. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "You clean up right nice when you try, Tommy." In the distance, Silver Creek's church bell began to toll, calling the faithful to witness a wedding. Thomas Henderson straightened his string tie, brushed off his boots, and mounted up. He didn't know it yet, but he was riding toward a moment that would change everything. The church register lay open on Reverend Parker's lectern, its blank lines waiting to record another marriage in Silver Creek's history. The morning sun streamed through plain glass windows, casting long rectangles of light across the wooden pews where nearly every soul in town sat waiting. drawn by curiosity as much as Christian charity. James Montgomery stood at the altar, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as a man apart from the hard-working ranchers and shopkeepers who filled the church. His expression as Sarah Whitman walked down the aisle shifted from anticipation to confusion, then to something harder and colder than the Montana winter. "This is some kind of joke," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed church. "You never mentioned you were—" He gestured dismissively at Sarah's face, her silver-streaked hair, the gentle lines around her eyes. "I was expecting a proper bride, not someone old enough to be a grandmother." Sarah stood perfectly still, her hands clutching her wildflower bouquet so tightly that a few petals drifted to the floor. "Your letters said age didn't matter," she said quietly, dignity in every word. "You wrote that wisdom and grace were what you valued." Montgomery's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Those were just words to ensure I got an educated woman, someone who could handle the social obligations of my position. I never meant—" He turned to the congregation, playing to his audience. "Look at her. I'm supposed to present this as my wife at the Cattle Association dinner?" From his place in the back pew, Thomas Henderson felt something shift inside him, like earth breaking apart after a long freeze. He watched a single tear track down Sarah's cheek, though she held herself straight as a pine tree in a storm. "I can't do this," Montgomery announced, already turning away. "The whole thing is void. I never agreed to marry someone so obviously past her prime. I have a reputation to consider." The silence that followed was heavy with collective shame. Shame that not one person stood up, that they all sat witnessing this cruel spectacle as if it were just another Sunday entertainment. Mrs. Bailey half rose from her seat, but her husband pulled her back down with a warning glance toward Montgomery's influential position in town. Sarah began to turn away from the altar, her cream silk dress whispering against the wooden floor. The sound of her dignity in the face of such public humiliation was louder than any scream could have been. Thomas found himself on his feet before he'd made any conscious decision to move. His boots sounded heavy on the church floor as he stepped into the center aisle. Years of quiet living had taught him to listen to his instincts, and every one of them was telling him this moment mattered more than any that had come before. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from lack of use, but carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "If you're willing, I'd be proud to take his place." The entire congregation seemed to hold its breath. Sarah turned slowly, her tear-stained face a study in disbelief and cautious hope. "You don't even know me," she whispered. "I know enough," Thomas said, moving closer. "I know you traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of written promises, carrying hope in your heart. I know you faced public cruelty with more grace than most folks show in private triumph." He paused, then added softly, "And I know that any man who can't see your worth isn't worth your tears." Montgomery's scornful laugh broke the moment. "Well, this is perfect. Henderson's little dirt farm and a worn-out bride. You deserve each." "Other?" Thomas kept his eyes on Sarah, seeing past the tears to the strength beneath. "He's right about one thing, ma'am. I've got nothing grand to offer, just honest work and a quiet life. But if you'd consider it, I promise you'd never face mockery or cruelty in my home." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, seeing the truth in his steady gaze. Then, with deliberate care, she took the wedding ring from her finger, Montgomery's. Ring sent in his last letter, and placed it on the altar. "I would be honored," she said clearly, "to consider your offer." The church erupted in whispers as Sarah walked down the aisle toward Thomas. He offered his arm, and she took it, her hand trembling slightly, but her step sure. Reverend Parker cleared his throat. "The church register," he said uncertainly, "needs a name." "Then write mine," Thomas said quietly, "if the lady agrees." Sarah's hand tightened on his arm, and she nodded once, firmly. Together, they walked to the altar, leaving Montgomery's ring behind like a discarded symbol of false promises, while the register waited for a different story to be written in its pages. In the church's small side room, Thomas Henderson held out his mother's gold band, simple and worn smooth by years of honest work. "It's not much to look at," he said softly, "but it's got 40 years of happy marriage in it. My pa gave it too. My ma when they first came out here, before they'd built anything but dreams." Sarah sat on a faded velvet chair, her cream silk dress catching the light from the single window. The past hour had passed in a blur of quiet conversation and careful consideration, while outside they could hear the town's excited whispers dying down as most of the congregation dispersed. "Mr. Henderson," she began. "Thomas," he corrected, gently. "Seems right we should use Christian names considering." "Thomas," she smiled slightly. "Are you certain about this? I'm a stranger to you, and this is no small decision." He pulled up a worn wooden chair, sitting so they were eye to eye. "Miss Whitman, Sarah, I've lived 48 years in this territory, learned to read weather, judge character, know true value from false shine." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What I saw out there wasn't just Montgomery's poor judgment. I saw courage, dignity, the kind that comes from living life honest, facing hard truths without losing your grace." Sarah's fingers twisted. In her lap. "I'm not young," she said plainly. "I have gray in my hair and lines around my eyes, and I know nothing about ranching." "I've got silver in my beard," Thomas answered with a quiet smile, "and calluses on my hands. As for ranching, well, that can be learned, characters born in, and you've got more of that than most folks I've known." He held out the ring again. "This isn't about rescue, Sarah, or pity. It's about seeing something true and valuable and being willing to take a chance on it. I can offer you a partnership, a quiet life, but one built on respect." Sarah touched the ring gently. "Tell me about your ranch. 50 acres paid for, small herd of cattle, good grazing land. The house needs work. Been meaning to fix the front porch for 2 summers now, but it's solid, like the life I'm offering. No fancy promises, just honest truth." "And what would you expect of me?" "Your company," he said simply, "your help with what you can manage, your willingness to learn what you don't know, and time to see if we can build something real from this strange beginning." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his weathered face. "Why did you really stand up back there?" Thomas looked down at the ring in his palm. "My ma used to say God puts opportunities in front of us, disguised as choices. When I saw you standing there, holding on to your dignity, while others looked away, well, something inside me knew this was one of those moments." He met her eyes. "I can't promise you riches or an easy life, but I can promise you'll never face cruelty in my home, never have your worth questioned, never stand alone against unkindness." Sarah reached out slowly and took the ring from his palm. "Then I think, Thomas Henderson, we should speak with Reverend Parker." The ceremony that followed was simple, witnessed only by Mrs. Bailey and her husband. The Reverend spoke of faith, hope, and charity, but mostly of courage, the courage to recognize God's hand in unexpected moments. When Thomas slipped his mother's ring onto Sarah's finger, his hands were steady and sure. The gold band, though, old, caught the afternoon light like a promise kept. "What happens now?" Sarah asked softly as they signed the register, her new name written in careful strokes beneath his. "Now," Thomas said, offering his arm, "we go home. Take each hour as it comes. Build something true." As they stepped out of the church, the mountain air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. Sarah's cream silk dress rustled against Thomas's Sunday coat, and his mother's ring sat warm and right on her finger, as if it had been waiting all these years for just this moment. Thomas's wagon creaked softly as they made their way out of Silver Creek, the afternoon sun warming the worn wooden seats. Sarah sat beside him, her carpet bag and small trunk secured in the back, all her worldly possessions packed carefully. Beside a few sacks of feed Thomas had bought earlier that morning, before his life had taken such an unexpected turn. "It's about 5 miles to the ranch," he said, handling the reins with practiced ease. "Not a long journey, but it'll give you a good look at the country." He paused, glancing at her cream silk dress. "I should have thought to bring a blanket for the seat." Wagon's not as clean as it might be. I've sat on worse, Sarah replied, smoothing her skirts with practical hands. And dresses can be washed. Something in her practical tone made Thomas smile, recognizing a kindred spirit in facing life's realities. They passed the last buildings of Silver Creek, the road narrowing to a well-worn track that wound through scrubby pine and sage. The mountains rose before them, snow still clinging to their peaks despite the spring warmth in the valley. Beautiful country, Sarah observed, her eyes taking in the vast landscape. Different from anything in Boston. More honest somehow. Thomas nodded. That's a good word for it. Land out here doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. Shows its character plain, if you know how to look. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, its cry carrying clearly in the thin air. Sarah watched it for a moment before speaking again. I should tell you something, Thomas, about my life in Boston. Only if you want to. I was a seamstress, she said quietly. 20 years in one of the better shops. Made wedding dresses for other women, watched them start their lives while mine. She touched her own cream silk skirts. Well, I made this one for myself, believing in words in letters. Thomas was quiet for a moment, handling the reins with careful thought. Useful skill, sewing. Ranch always needs mending. Clothes, blankets, grain sacks, and it tells me something else about you. What's that? That you understand the value of patience, of doing things right, stitch by stitch. He gestured toward a distant ridge. Ranch lies just beyond there. Not much to look at compared to what Montgomery promised you, but every fence post was set by my own hands, every acre paid for honest. Sarah studied his profile, seeing the quiet pride in his bearing. Tell me about your family, she said, the ones who owned this ring before us. As the wagon rolled on, Thomas spoke of his parents, their journey west when he was just a boy, the years of building something from nothing, their love for each other that had weathered every hardship. His voice grew soft when he mentioned their passing 8 years ago within months of each other. They taught me what matters, he said simply. Not the size of your spread or the fancy of your house, but the truth in your word and the strength. In your partnership, the wagon crested a small rise, and Thomas drew the horses to a halt. Below them lay his ranch, modest but neat, with a small house, barn, and corral. A creek wound through the property, its banks green with early spring growth. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark dots against the grassland. Well, he said quietly, that's home. Not what you came west expecting, I know. Sarah looked at the small ranch for a long moment, seeing not what it lacked, but what it offered. Peace, honesty, the chance to build something real. Sometimes, she said carefully, life gives you something better than what you thought you wanted. Thomas's hands tightened slightly on the reins. That's a mighty generous way to look at it. No, she said, touching his arm gently. It's an honest way. Like this land of yours. He nodded once, understanding all she hadn't said, and clicked to the horses. The wagon rolled forward, carrying them down the slope toward their shared future, while behind them the setting sun turned the mountains to gold and purple shadow. The cast-iron stove dominated the ranch house kitchen, its black surface reflecting the last rays of sunlight through the western window. Sarah stood before it, running her hand along its worn surface, while Thomas brought in her trunk. This would be her domain now, this kitchen with its simple furnishings and well-used tools. Hasn't had a woman's touch since Ma passed, Thomas said from the doorway, his voice carrying a hint of apology. Been meaning to give it a proper cleaning, but you've been busy keeping the ranch running, Sarah finished for him, understanding in her tone. She opened the stove's door, examining its interior with practical eyes. Good stove, solid, heats the whole room, I expect. That it does. Saved my life more than once during winter storms. He hesitated, then added, There's coffee in the pantry. If you'd like to... Sarah was already moving, her cream silk wedding dress incongruous against the rustic surroundings as she found the coffee pot and beans. Her movements were sure and purposeful, as if she'd decided that the best way to face this sudden change in her life was to meet it head-on, starting with the simple ritual of making coffee. "Sit," she told Thomas, and he did, watching as she worked. The familiar sounds of coffee being prepared filled the kitchen, the grinding of beans, the scrape of the stove lid, the gentle splash of water. They were homey sounds, sounds that had been missing from this kitchen for too long. "I should show you the rest of the house," Thomas said, but made no move to rise. There was something mesmerizing about watching Sarah move through his kitchen, bringing life back to its quiet corners. "In a moment," she replied, measuring coffee with careful precision. "First, we'll have something warm to drink, and you can tell me about tomorrow's work. I'd rather know what to expect than sit up half." The night wandering, the coffee pot began to bubble, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. Sarah found 2 cups in the cupboard, wiped them clean with her handkerchief, and set them on the table. Only then did she look down at her wedding dress and laugh softly. "Well, this isn't quite the right outfit for ranch work, is it?" "You look beautiful in it," Thomas said quietly, then flushed slightly at his own directness. Sarah's eyes softened. "Thank you. I made it thinking, well, it doesn't matter what I was thinking. What matters is where I am now." She poured the coffee with steady hands. "Tell me about the morning routine. I want to be useful, not just decorative." Thomas wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "Sunrise start. Cattle need checking, especially with calving season. Then there's the chicken coop. Hadn't mentioned. And yet, just 4 hens, but they're good layers when they're minded properly. Chickens I can handle. Had an aunt in Vermont who kept them. What else?" And so they sat in the growing dusk, planning out their tomorrow while the coffee steamed between them. Thomas outlined the ranch's needs, feeding schedules, maintenance tasks, the 1,000 small jobs that kept a working ranch going. Sarah listened intently, asking practical questions that showed she was already thinking about how to fit herself into this new life. When the coffee was gone, Thomas lit the lamp and showed her the rest of the house. It was small but solid, 2 bedrooms, a front parlor that doubled as a dining room, the kitchen that was clearly the heart of the home. Everything was plain, functional, and well-maintained, if not quite as clean as it could be. "I'll take the spare room," Thomas said, stopping at its door. Until you decide otherwise." Sarah touched his arm gently. "Thank you for understanding that some things need time to grow natural." He nodded, understanding completely. "Time and truth between us. That's all I ask." Later, after Thomas had gone to do the evening chores, Sarah stood in what was now her bedroom, changing from her wedding dress into a simple cotton gown. The dress she hung carefully in the closet, not as a reminder of false promises, but as a symbol of how life could surprise you with something better than what you'd planned. Through the window, she could hear Thomas in the barn, his quiet voice talking to the horses as he finished up. The sun had set, painting the mountains in deep purple shadow, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Sarah touched her mother's silver mirror, now sitting on the simple dresser, and whispered, "Well, Mama, this isn't the life I thought I was coming west to find, but maybe it's the life I was meant to have all along." A week after the wedding, Sarah stood at the mercantile's counter, watching Mr. Potter tally their supplies on a fresh receipt. She noticed how the prices seemed mysteriously higher than the ones marked on the shelves, but she held her peace, remembering Thomas's quiet warning about how the town might react at first. "That'll be $12.43, Mr. Potter announced, his tone suggesting he expected argument or inability to pay. The price was nearly double what it should have been, and they both knew it. Sarah opened her worn leather purse. With deliberate calm, "I'll need a copy of that receipt, Mr. Potter. My husband likes to keep careful records." She emphasized the word husband slightly, noting how the merchant's expression shifted at her dignified tone. From across the store, she could hear Mrs. Whitaker and Mrs. Carson discussing her loudly enough to be certain she'd hear every word. Barely. Married a week to Montgomery and already caught herself another man. And Thomas Henderson, of all people, always seemed such a sensible soul. Must have been desperate at her age. Sarah counted out exact change, placed it on the counter, and waited patiently for her receipt. When Mr. Potter finally handed it over, she folded it carefully and tucked it into her purse. "Thank you. I trust next time the prices will more closely match those posted on your shelves. My husband and I believe in fair dealing. Both ways." Toot, subtle warning in her tone, wasn't lost on the merchant. She gathered her purchases with quiet dignity and stepped out onto the boardwalk, where Thomas waited with the wagon. He took one look at her face and understood. "Potter's special pricing?" he asked softly, helping her up onto the seat. "Indeed." She handed him the receipt. "I believe we'll need to discuss alternative arrangements for our supplies." Thomas studied. The inflated prices, his expression thoughtful. "Could ride over to Preston's Creek, bit further, but Jack Preston's always dealt fair." He glanced at her. "Unless you'd rather I spoke with Potter." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We'll simply take our business elsewhere. Let them see we won't be bullied, but won't stoop to quarrelling either." As Thomas clicked to the horses, Sarah became aware of movement near the millinery shop. James Montgomery stood in its doorway, obviously deliberating whether to approach or retreat. His face showed a mixture of anger and something that might have been regret. "Sarah," he called out, starting forward, "I feel I should explain—" "Good day, Mr. Montgomery," she interrupted calmly, keeping her eyes forward. "I believe all necessary explanations were made quite clear in church." Thomas said nothing, but she felt his quiet strength beside her as Montgomery fell back, frustrated by her composed dismissal. They drove on in comfortable silence until they reached the edge of town. "You handled that well," Thomas observed finally. "I've had practice," Sarah replied. 20 years in Boston's finest dress shop taught me how to deal with difficult people while keeping my dignity." She smoothed her skirts, now made of practical cotton rather than silk. "Though I admit knowing I have your support makes it easier." Thomas nodded, understanding all she wasn't saying. They rode a bit further before he spoke again. "Town's got to work through its opinions, like creek water after a storm, muddy at first, but runs clear if you give it time. And if it doesn't, then we'll do what we need to. Preston's Creek has a fine mercantile, better church too, truth be told." He glanced at her. "But you shouldn't have to hide away because of their gossip." Sarah touched his arm gently. "I'm not hiding, Thomas. I'm choosing where to spend my time and our money. There's a difference." They crested the hill that opened up the view of their ranch, and Sarah felt something settle in her heart. After a week, she was already thinking of it as home, this modest spread with its honest work and quiet peace. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I was so focused on what I thought I wanted, Montgomery's fine house and social position, that I nearly missed what I needed. A place where I could be myself, without pretense." Thomas's hands were steady on the reins as he guided the horses down the familiar trail. "Reckon that's something we both found when we weren't looking for it." The receipt crinkled in Sarah's purse, a reminder of the town's judgment, but somehow it seemed less important with every step the horses took toward home. Let them talk, she thought. The truth of what she and Thomas were building would speak louder than any gossip given time. Sarah's new garden tools lay in the freshly turned earth, a hoe, spade, and hand trowel that Thomas had brought back from Preston's Creek the week before. Their wooden handles were smooth and sturdy, their metal surfaces gleaming with promise. In the morning light, to Sarah, they represented more than just implements. They were her first real investment in making this land her own. "The soil's good here," Thomas said, kneeling beside her to test the earth with experienced hands. "My mother always said this spot had the right mix of sun and shade. Used to grow enough vegetables to see us through winter before she got sick." Sarah ran her fingers through the dirt, remembering the small herb garden she'd tended on her Boston windowsill. "Show me what she grew? What worked best?" Thomas's face softened at her interest. "Potatoes near the back fence? They like the deeper soil there. Beans along these posts. They'll climb come summer. Carrots, onions, squash." His hands sketched out plots in the air as he spoke, sharing years of accumulated knowledge. The morning unfolded slowly as they worked together, Thomas demonstrating how to gauge the depth for different seeds, Sarah applying the precise attention to detail she'd learned from years of dressmaking to the careful rows she planted. Her back ached from the unfamiliar work, but there was satisfaction in seeing the neat furrows take shape. "Your mother taught you all this?" she asked during a water break, wiping her brow with her apron. "She did. Said a man ought to know how to grow his own food, same as a woman ought to know how to cook it. Never believed in dividing work too strict between men's and women's tasks." He paused, watching her handle the tools with increasing confidence. "Like you with the cattle yesterday. Doing what needs doing, regardless of custom." Sarah smiled, remembering her first attempt at helping with the herd. "Well, once you understand that cattle are just like difficult customers in a dress shop, needing firm handling but gentle guidance, it's not so different from my old work." That drew a chuckle from Thomas. "Never thought of it that way. Though I reckon you're right. Patience and good judgment serve well in both cases." They worked through the morning, the garden taking shape under their shared effort. When Sarah discovered a volunteer strawberry plant that had survived from his mother's time, Thomas showed her how to tend it, how to clear the space around it so it might spread and flourish. "Like us," she said softly, carefully loosening the soil around the hardy plant. "Taking root in unexpected places." Thomas's hands stilled on his spade. "Sarah," he began, then hesitated. "Yes? Are you finding any contentment here? I know it's not what you came west expecting." Sarah sat back on her heels, considering the question with the honesty it deserved. "I came west expecting a life of leisure in a fine house with servants to do the work. And yes, sometimes my muscles ache from tasks I never thought I'd do, and my dresses get muddied in ways no Boston lady would approve of." She touched the strawberry plant gently. "But there's something real here, Thomas. In the work we share, in watching things grow under our care, in knowing that what we build together is honest and true." "I never expected to find that kind of contentment," he nodded, understanding all she wasn't saying. "Still, if there's things you need, comforts I might provide." "What I need," she said firmly, "is right here. A partner who respects me, work that matters, and the chance to build something lasting." She picked up her trowel again. "Now show me where your mother planted her herbs. I saw wild sage on the north slope yesterday, but I'd like to start a proper kitchen garden closer to the house." They worked until noon, the garden expanding under their shared vision. Sarah's new tools moved with increasing sureness, transforming the long-neglected plot into ordered rows of promise. Each seed they planted felt like a commitment to their shared future, each carefully marked row a statement of faith in what they were building together. When they finally stopped for dinner, their hands were dirty, but their hearts were light. Sarah looked back at their morning's work, at the neat rows and carefully placed markers, and felt a deep satisfaction. This garden, like their marriage, might have started unexpectedly, but it would grow strong through patient tending and shared purpose. In the quiet of evening, Sarah's fingers moved steadily across the quilt top, each stitch joining pieces of their shared life together. She'd started it the week after Thomas brought home a bundle of wool batting from Preston's Creek, combining sturdy fabric from her old Boston dresses with worn but serviceable shirts he'd been saving for patches. Now, as autumn painted the mountains in fierce colors, the quilt was nearly finished. "That's fine work," Thomas said from his chair by the stove, where he was mending a harness. The firelight caught the silver in his hair, and Sarah found herself studying his profile, so familiar now after months of shared days and quiet evenings. "My mother always said a proper quilt tells a story," she replied, touching a square cut from her cream silk wedding dress. "This one's telling ours, I suppose." The evening settled around them like a comfortable shawl, filled with the homey sounds of crickets through the open window, the crackle of the stove, the soft whisper of thread through fabric. These quiet hours had become precious to them both. You'd time to share the day's events and plan for tomorrow's needs. Saw weather signs today, Thomas said, testing the strength of his leather stitching. First, snow will come early this year, maybe 3 weeks, by my reckoning. Sarah nodded, tucking this information away with all she'd learned about ranch life. The root cellar's nearly full, and the dried beans from the garden filled 4 crocks. Your mother's notes on preserving proved invaluable. She'd be pleased, knowing her knowledge was being put to good use. He paused, then added softly, "She'd be pleased by a lot of things, I think." Sarah felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. Over the months, they'd grown comfortable with such moments of quiet affection, like wild roses blooming in unexpected places. "The South pasture cattle," she said, returning to practical matters. "Will they need moving before the snow?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing to help. They're gentle enough now, seem to have taken to your way of handling them." Sarah smiled, remembering her first terrified encounters with the herd. "Well, as I said, they're not so different from difficult customers. Though I admit, none of my Boston clients ever tried to chase me up a fence." Thomas's laugh filled the room, deep and genuine. These moments of shared humor had grown more frequent, another sign of the ease developing between them. "Speaking of Boston," he said carefully, "letter came today from your friend Margaret. Saw the postmark when I picked up supplies." Sarah's hands stilled on the quilt. "Did you worry I'd be homesick reading it? Natural to miss familiar things." "I did at first," she admitted, resuming her stitching. "Missed my workroom at the dress shop, the bells of Trinity Church, even the smell of the harbor on summer evenings. But now," she gestured to the comfortable room around them, to the quilt growing under her hands. "This is home. These are the familiar things I'd miss." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands still on the harness. "Sarah?" "Yes?" "Been meaning to ask. That is, winter nights get mighty cold here." She felt her heart quicken, understanding what he was trying to say. These past months had seen their relationship deepen from careful friendship to something warmer, but Thomas had kept his promise about giving her time, sleeping in the spare room while they learned each other's ways. "I've noticed the nights getting cooler," she said softly, helping him find the words. "Thought maybe, if you were willing, it might be time to share the main room. The bed's bigger, catches more warmth from the stove." He stopped, flushing slightly. "But only if you're ready." Sarah set down her quilting, crossed to his chair, and touched his weathered cheek gently. "I think, Thomas Henderson, that would be just right." His hand covered hers, work-roughened fingers threading through her softer ones. No more words were needed. Like everything else in their life together, this step would be taken naturally, with honest hearts and quiet joy. Later, as moonlight spilled through the window, Sarah added the final stitches to the quilt's border. Tomorrow it would cover their shared bed, a testament to how love could be built piece by piece, stitch by stitch, growing stronger with each passing season. The lantern's flame wavered in the howling wind as Thomas hung it on the barn's center post, its light creating a small circle of warmth in the frigid darkness. Outside, the storm raged with unexpected fury, snow driving sideways across the ranch with a force that made the building's timbers creak. "The pregnant heifer?" Sarah asked, her voice nearly lost in the wind's roar. She stood beside him, wrapped in his mother's old beaver coat, her hair dusted with snow that had blown in when they'd fought their way across the yard. "Back stall," Thomas answered, already moving. "She shouldn't have calved for another week, but the storms brought it on early." Sarah followed, carrying their medical kit, a collection of supplies they'd assembled together over the months, her knowledge of sewing combining with his experience of cattle to create something more useful than either had alone. The heifer lay on her side in the straw, her sides heaving with effort. Thomas knelt beside her, his experienced hands checking her condition. "Calf's turned wrong," he said grimly. "We'll lose them both if we can't set it right." Sarah was all ready, rolling up her sleeves, her face set with determination. "Tell me what you need." For the next hour, they worked together in the lantern light, Thomas guiding the calf, while Sarah helped hold the heifer steady, murmuring soothing words that seemed to calm both animal and man. When Thomas had to rest, his aching arms, Sarah took his place, her smaller hands sometimes able to reach where his couldn't. "Like turning a difficult piece of fabric," she said through gritted teeth, following his instructions, finding the right angle, easing it through. The storm battered at the barn walls, but inside their circle of lamplight, nothing existed except their shared purpose. Thomas marveled at how steady Sarah remained, this woman who'd once lived such a different life, now deep in the brutal reality of ranch survival. "There!" Thomas's voice was triumphant as the calf finally shifted into the right position. "Now we wait." They sat together in the straw, shoulders touching, watching the heifer's progress. Sarah's hands were bloody despite the rags they'd used, but she showed no sign of distress. Instead, she maintained the same quiet stream of encouragement to the laboring animal. "Don't know if I could have managed this alone," Thomas admitted softly. Sarah's hand found his in the dim light. "You don't have to." Not anymore. The wind rose to a fever pitch outside, and suddenly the lantern flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Sarah's grip tightened on his hand, but her voice remained calm. "Where's the spare lamp?" "Other end of the barn, but we need to stay with her." "I'll go. Just keep talking so I can find my way back." Before he could protest, she was moving, one hand trailing along the rough barn wall. Thomas talked steadily, his voice a lifeline in the darkness, while continuing to monitor the heifer by touch alone. The minutes stretched like hours before he heard Sarah's careful return. Her triumphant, "Got it!" was followed by the scratch of a match, and warm light bloomed again in the barn. The renewed light showed the heifer's progress, and within moments they were both busy helping deliver the calf. When the small creature finally lay in the straw, wet and shaking, their shared look of joy needed no words. "Strong lungs," Sarah observed, as the calf's first cry cut through the storm's howl. She was already rubbing it dry with fresh straw, showing a natural instinct for the work. Thomas checked the heifer, ensuring she was recovering well, then helped Sarah get the calf nursing. Outside, the storm showed no sign of weakening, but here in their circle of lamplight, life was winning. "Storm's likely to last through tomorrow," he said, watching Sarah arrange clean straw around the pair. "We'll need to sleep out here tonight, make sure they're safe." "I'll get the quilts from the house," she said, then smiled at his worried look. "I'll tie a rope to the porch rail, follow it back. Been thinking about that since the storm began." He caught her arm before she could rise. "Sarah, thank you for being here, for facing this with me." She touched his cheek, her fingers still rough from their work, but infinitely gentle. "This is our life, Thomas. Our challenges, our victories. Where else would I be?" When she returned, carefully following her rope through the blizzard, they made a nest of quilts in a nearby stall. The lantern burned low but steady, a beacon in the darkness, while they kept watch over their saved charges. Sarah's head eventually drooped to Thomas's shoulder, her exhaustion finally showing, but her hand remained firmly clasped in his. Together they had faced the storm's fury and won, not through grand gestures or heroic actions, but through partnership, determination, and the quiet strength they'd built between them. The lantern's glow touched their faces, revealing tired smiles and the deep contentment of knowing that, whatever nature threw at them, they would face it together. Snow lay deep around the ranch house on Christmas Eve as Sarah carefully opened the wooden box containing Thomas's mother's sheet music. The yellowed pages held carols and hymns, some marked with marginal notes in faded ink, reminders of tempos, favorite verses, and memories of Christmases past. "Found it in the attic last week," Thomas explained, watching her gentle handling of the fragile papers. "Thought you might like to see it, being, as you mentioned, missing the church music in Boston." Sarah lifted out a carefully preserved copy of Silent Night, noticing how the corners were worn from years of use. A small note in the margin read, "Tommy's favorite, age 6. She smiled, touching the faded words. Did she play? Every Christmas Eve. Thomas moved to stand behind her chair, his hand warm on her shoulder. Had a small pump organ back then, sold it during the drought of '83. But she kept the music, said someday it might be needed again. Sarah studied the next page. "O come, all ye faithful," with careful German translations penciled between the lines. "Tell me about those Christmases, what traditions you had." Thomas sat in his chair by the fire, his eyes distant with memory. She'd start playing after supper, and Pa would read the Christmas story from the family Bible. Sometimes neighbors would ride over despite the cold. The music would fill the whole house. "We can have music again," Sarah said softly. "Not tonight, perhaps, but maybe next year. I saw a small organ at Preston's Creek Mercantile last month." "Sarah, that's too dear a purchase. We've had a good year, Thomas. The cattle prices were strong, and my preserves have been selling well in town." She'd started selling her extra preserves and pickles at Preston's Creek in the fall, building a steady clientele who appreciated her Boston-learned attention to detail. "Still," he began, but she cut him off with a gentle smile. "Let me do this. Not just for us, but for your mother's memory, for the music she kept safe all these years." He nodded, understanding. They sat quietly for a moment, watching the fire dance while snow fell past the windows. The house was warm, with the scents of pine boughs Sarah had gathered and the gingerbread she'd baked from his mother's recipe. "We had different traditions in Boston," she said after a while. "Midnight services at Trinity Church, with the choir singing carols in Latin, store windows all decorated with electric lights. But somehow," she looked around their snug room, at the simple decorations and warm firelight, "this feels more like Christmas should be, even without the fancy trappings, especially without them." She rose and went to the kitchen, returning with 2 cups of hot cider spiced with cinnamon from her carefully tended herb garden. "Though I did bring one city tradition with me." She handed Thomas a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with red yarn from her mending basket. "In Boston, we always opened one gift on Christmas Eve." Thomas took the package with careful hands. "Sarah, I didn't know. That is, your gift isn't wrapped yet." "Open it," she encouraged, settling back in her chair with her cider. He unwrapped the paper slowly, revealing a hand-knitted muffler in soft grey wool. "You made this?" "Mrs. Bailey taught me to knit this fall. Said every ranch wife should know how, for the cold months." She watched as he ran his fingers over the careful stitches. "I had to undo it 3 times before I got it right." "It's perfect," he said hoarsely. "Like everything you do." "Not perfect," she corrected gently, "but made with love. There's a difference." Thomas stood abruptly. "Wait here." He disappeared into their bedroom, returning with a wooden box that Sarah recognized from his workbench in the barn. "Was going to wrap it tomorrow, but, well, seems right to follow your tradition." Sarah opened the box to find a hand-carved picture frame, its corners decorated with delicate wild roses. "Thomas, it's beautiful. Thought we might put our wedding photograph in it, the one from last month when the traveling photographer came through Preston's Creek." He paused. "Unless you'd rather—" "It's exactly right," she said firmly, blinking back tears. "Perfect for our first Christmas portrait." They sat together in the firelight, sharing cider and memories while the snow fell silently outside. Sarah began to sing softly, reading from his mother's music sheets. Silent Night first, because it had been Small Tommy's favorite. Thomas joined in, his deep voice uncertain at first but growing stronger. The carols filled their home just as they had in Christmases past, but with new harmonies now, blending Boston refinement with frontier strength, creating something uniquely their own. When they finally went to bed, Sarah placed the sheet music carefully back in its box, but not before copying out Silent Night onto fresh paper. Some traditions, she knew, deserved to be carried forward, growing richer with each passing year. The seed catalogue lay open on the kitchen table between them, its pages worn from frequent handling throughout the long winter evenings. Sarah had marked certain pages with careful notes in her neat hand, while Thomas had done his own calculations. In the margins, together, their annotations told the story of their hopes for the coming season. "If we expand the garden plot past the old apple tree," Sarah said, pointing to her sketched layout, "we could add these new varieties of tomatoes. The Preston's Creek merchants say they'll take all we can grow, especially if we can them for winter sales." Thomas studied her calculations, noting how she'd worked out the costs against potential profits with the same precision she'd once applied to her dressmaking ledgers. "You've got a good head for business, love." The endearment slipped out naturally now, earned through months of shared work and quiet evenings. Sarah's eyes softened at the word, though she kept her tone practical. "I was thinking we could use the extra money to add that second milk cow you've been considering. Already planning that far ahead?" "Well," she said with a smile, "someone and taught me that ranch life means always thinking one season ahead while working in the present." The morning sun streamed through windows Sarah had polished until they gleamed, touching the fresh curtains she'd sewn during the winter months. The house had transformed under her care, becoming a perfect blend of practical comfort and simple beauty. "Speaking of planning ahead," Thomas said, turning to a dog-eared page in the catalogue, "been studying these new wheat varieties. Drought-resistant, according to the write-up. Thought we might try a small field, see how it does." Sarah leaned closer, their shoulders touching comfortably as they studied the description together. "Your father grew wheat here once, didn't he?" "Before the dry years, yes. Had to give it up when the rainfall changed." He paused, then added quietly, "But things change. Weather patterns, farming methods, people's dreams." She caught the meaning. In his tone, "You're thinking beyond cattle now?" "Thinking beyond what we've always done, maybe. Ranches paid for, cattle herds healthy. Might be time to try some new directions." His hand found hers on the catalogue's pages. "If you're willing." "Thomas Henderson," she said with fond exasperation, "when have I ever not been willing to try something new with you?" He chuckled, acknowledging the truth of it. This woman who'd once lived such a different life had thrown herself into ranch work with determination and grace, learning everything from cattle handling to cheese making, always eager to expand their possibilities. "Got another idea to run past you," he said, flipping to the catalogue's final pages. "Been thinking about the old orchard, how my mother used to talk about expanding it." Sarah's eyes lit up. "The apples this fall were wonderful. And the preserves sold well. Thought we might order some new saplings. Take a few years to bear fruit, but—" He hesitated. "Well, seems right to plant things that'll grow with us long-term." "Long-term," she repeated softly, understanding all he wasn't saying. They'd grown cautious about speaking too far into the future, both aware of their ages, both grateful for whatever time they had together. But there was something powerful in planning beyond the immediate season, in believing in tomorrows. The Preston's Creek schoolteacher was asking if we'd consider boarding her next term, Sarah said thoughtfully. The extra income would cover the saplings, and it'd be nice having young energy in the house. Thomas nodded, seeing how she was weaving their various plans together, practical and hopeful all at once. "You miss having people around sometimes, don't you? The bustle of city life?" "Not the city," she corrected, "but I do like the idea of our home being a place where others feel welcome, like it must have been when your mother played the organ on Christmas Eve." He studied her face in the morning light, seeing the strength and joy there that had nothing to do with the fancy life she'd once dreamed of. "We could build a proper porch this summer," he offered, "with room for chairs, maybe even a swing." Sarah's answering smile was brighter than the spring sunshine. "I'd like that. Somewhere to sit in the evenings, watch the sunset together." They bent over the catalogue again, making notes and sketching dreams. The pages were filled with more than just seeds and saplings. They held the promise of continued growth, of a future being cultivated as carefully as their expanding garden. Like the land itself, their love had deepened through every season, putting down roots neither had expected to find so late in life. The newspaper article sat on their kitchen table like an unwelcome guest, its bold headline announcing the collapse of James Montgomery's cattle empire. Sarah had brought it home from Preston's Creek, where whispers of bankruptcy and scandal had already begun to spread through the territory. Sources say Montgomery's recent speculation in railroad shares has left him deeply in debt, she read aloud, while Thomas stood at the window, his posture tense. Several prominent banks in Helena have called in their loans. He'll come back, Thomas said quietly, still looking out at the spring evening. Men like Montgomery always try to rebuild on familiar ground. Sarah set the paper aside, studying her husband's face in the fading light. You've been expecting this. Been hearing rumors these past months. Cattle prices dropping in the eastern markets, rail companies going under. He turned to face her. Sarah, if he tries to what, Thomas? Reclaim a woman who was never his? She stood, moving to take his work-roughened hands in hers. I'm exactly where I choose to be. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for the spring planting they'd planned. They were just finishing breakfast when they heard hoofbeats in the yard. Thomas reached the door first, opening it to find James Montgomery sitting astride an expensive horse that showed signs of hard travel. Henderson. Montgomery nodded curtly, then raised his voice. Sarah, we need to talk. Sarah appeared in the doorway beside Thomas, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that spoke volumes. Whatever you have to say, Mr. Montgomery, you can say it to both of us. Montgomery's face tightened at her calm tone. He looked thinner than when they'd last seen him, his expensive suit showing signs of wear. I've come to make things right, to offer you the life you originally came west for. The life I came west for, Sarah repeated softly. Or the life you need now. I've had time to reconsider, Montgomery pressed on, to realize I acted hastily that day in church. You're an educated woman, Sarah, with refined tastes. Surely these months of primitive living have shown you what you're missing? Thomas remained silent beside her, his body tense but his face composed. This was Sarah's battle to fight, and he respected her enough to let her face it. What I'm missing? Sarah's voice held a note of wonder. Let me tell you what I've found instead, Mr. Montgomery. I found honest work that brings real satisfaction. I found a home where I'm valued for who I am, not what I represent. And I found love that doesn't need fancy trappings to prove its worth. Love? Montgomery's laugh held an edge of desperation. You can't possibly prefer this dirt farmer to what I can offer. My setback is temporary. With your help, your social connections back east. Ah, Sarah said quietly. Now we come to it. She stepped forward, Thomas's solid presence behind her giving her strength. You don't want me, Mr. Montgomery. You want what you think I can provide. But everything I am, everything I have to give, belongs right here, with him. Montgomery gestured dismissively at Thomas. Living in this backwater, doing manual labor like a common servant? With my husband, Sarah corrected firmly, building something real together. Something that doesn't depend on railroad shares or bank loans to prove its value. Thomas's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. Montgomery's gaze fell to their joined hands, seeing perhaps for the first time the truth of what he'd lost through his own arrogance. The banks may have called in your loans, Sarah continued, her voice gentler now, but they can't call in our happiness. What we've built here isn't measured in dollars or social standing. It's measured in trust, in shared work, in quiet evenings and honest mornings. You're making a mistake, Montgomery said, but his voice had lost its conviction. No, Sarah replied, simply, my only mistake was ever thinking I needed fancy promises to find happiness. Good day, Mr. Montgomery. I wish you well, but my life is here. She turned back toward the house, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. Those social connections you mentioned, they're quite impressed with my preserved goods. Seems Boston ladies have developed quite a taste for frontier authenticity. We're shipping our third order east next week. With quiet dignity, she and Thomas walked back into their home, closing the door on Montgomery and all he represented. Through the window they watched him ride away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Well," Thomas said finally, "reckon we still have those tomato seedlings to plant." Sarah smiled, touching his cheek gently. "Yes, we do, and Thomas, thank you for letting me fight that battle my own way." "Never doubted you would," he replied simply. "Not for a minute." They stepped out into their spring morning, the newspaper forgotten on the table behind them. Their life together had been tested and proven true, like gold refined in fire. The seedlings waited, the soil was ready, and their future stretched before them, as rich with promise as the morning sun. The ranch deed lay on Lawyer Bennett's desk in Preston's Creek, its crisp new pages waiting for signatures. Thomas had ridden into town early to have it drawn up, and now Sarah sat beside him as the lawyer explained the document's significance. "This will put the ranch in both your names," Bennett said, his earlier professional detachment warming as he watched them together. "Equal partners in all respects, legally speaking." "As we have been in truth since the beginning," Thomas said quietly, his hand finding Sarah's. The news of Montgomery's visit had spread through the territory faster than spring wildfire, transformed, in the telling, into something of a frontier romance. Sarah's clear choice of honest love over restored wealth had captured the imagination of even their harshest critics. "Must admit," Bennett said, straightening his spectacles, "when you two married so sudden-like, I had my doubts. Plenty of us did." He cleared his throat. "Appears we were wrong." Sarah smiled, remembering the cold shoulders and inflated prices of those early days. "Time has a way of revealing truth, Mr. Bennett." "That it does, ma'am. That it does." He pushed the deed forward. "Now, if you'll both sign here." Their signatures flowed across the page, Sarah's elegant Boston penmanship beside Thomas's careful rancher's hand. As Bennett sanded the ink, Sarah thought about all the documents that had marked their journey, from Montgomery's false promises to this genuine sharing of everything they'd built together. Outside the lawyer's office, Preston's Creek was busy with spring trade. Heads turned as they emerged, but the looks now held respect rather than judgment. Mrs. Preston herself hurried over from the mercantile, her arms full of fabric. "Sarah, I've just got in some lovely gingham that would suit your preserves labels." "Perfectly. And Thomas, Jack wants a word about those new wheat varieties you're trying. Says he might be interested in some seed if your crop proves out." It was a far cry from the suspicious silence that had greeted their early visits to town. Sarah felt Thomas's quiet pleasure in the change, though his manner remained reserved. "We were just heading to the hotel for dinner," she said. "Would you and Jack care to join us?" The hotel dining room was busy with the lunch crowd, but conversation stilled momentarily as they entered. Sarah heard her name whispered, followed by phrases that would have once hurt but now brought a smile. "Chose the quiet rancher. Turned down Montgomery flat. Best preserves this side of Helena. Folk sure do love a good romance," Thomas murmured as they were seated. "They love a true one," Sarah corrected gently. "And ours, despite its strange beginning, is as true as they come." The Prestons joined them, and soon Jack was deep in discussion with Thomas about crop rotation and soil management. Sarah and Mrs. Preston, "Call me Mary, dear," discussed plans for expanding the preserve business. "You've shown us all something important," Mary said during a lull in the conversation, "about judging too quick, about what really matters." "We didn't set out to prove anything," Sarah replied. "We just lived according to our heart's truth." And that's exactly what proved so much. After dinner, they stepped out onto the boardwalk to find Ben Potter from Silver Creek waiting nervously. He twisted his hat in his hands, glancing between them. "Mr. Henderson, Mrs. Henderson, wanted to say, that is." He straightened his shoulders. "Our mercantile's under new management now. My boys taking over, doing things proper. We'd be honored to carry your preserves if you're willing, at fair prices, mind." Sarah felt Thomas's hand tighten on hers, knowing he remembered those early inflated receipts. But his voice was steady as he replied, "Reckon we could discuss terms." The ride home was peaceful, the spring evening painting the mountains in soft colors. Their horses walked close together, comfortable as their riders in shared silence. "Quite a day," Thomas said finally. "New deed, new business opportunities, new chapter," Sarah added, then smiled. "Though I find I'm most looking forward to getting home." "Oh? Mary gave me her recipe for sourdough bread. Thought I might try it tonight. Let it rise in that warm corner by the stove, fill the house with good smells while we sit on the porch and watch the sunset." Thomas's face softened. "Simple pleasures, the best kind." Sarah looked ahead to where their ranch was just becoming visible in the distance. "You know, when that journalist from Helena asked to write about our romantic tale, I tried to explain that the real romance isn't in dramatic moments or grand gestures. No, it's in sharing work and dreams, in choosing each other every day, in building something lasting together." She paused, then added softly, "In knowing that every piece of paper that's tried to define us, from Montgomery's letters to today's deed, matters less than the truth we've written in our daily lives." They rode on toward home, the new deed, secure in Thomas's saddlebag. But the real proof of their partnership was in the gentle synchronicity of their movements, the shared understanding in their silence, and the quiet joy of returning to the life they'd built together. The traveling photographer's camera stood ready on its tripod in front of the ranch house, while inside, Sarah smoothed her best dress, not the cream silk from a year ago, but a practical blue cotton trimmed with careful embroidery she'd done during winter evenings. Their first wedding portrait was about to be taken, a year and a lifetime after their unexpected union. "Almost ready?" Thomas called from the porch. He wore his good suit, the one Sarah had altered to fit him properly, and had trimmed his beard, neatly for the occasion. "Just a moment." Sarah checked her reflection one last time in her mother's silver mirror, now hanging proudly in their bedroom. The woman who looked back at her seemed both familiar and transformed, the same features, but somehow softer, more content. A few more strands of silver threaded her dark hair, but her eyes held a quiet joy that no amount of Boston sophistication had ever given her. Outside, the ranch showed the effects of their year together. The garden had expanded beyond its original boundaries, neat rows of vegetables stretching toward the new orchard saplings. The porch Thomas had built during the summer now wrapped around two sides of the house, complete with the promised swing, where they spent peaceful evenings, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "You look beautiful," Thomas said as she joined him on the porch. His voice held the same quiet admiration it had that first day in church, but now it was deepened by a year of shared joys and challenges. The photographer, a young man named Davis, who'd been traveling through the territory taking portraits of ranch families, adjusted his equipment. "Perfect light today," he observed. "And if you don't mind my saying, you two have the look of folks who are comfortable together. Makes for a better picture." Sarah smiled at that, as Thomas helped her arrange her skirts on the porch swing. Comfortable was exactly right, not the passionate romance of penny novels, but something deeper and more lasting. "Now then, Davis," said from behind his camera, "tell me how you'd like to be posed." "Just as we are," Sarah replied, her hand finding Thomas's naturally. "This is where we spend our evenings, sharing the day's events. Planning tomorrow's work," Thomas added. "Or sometimes just sitting quiet together," Sarah finished. Davis nodded approvingly. "Natural is best, though." He glanced at their garden and the productive ranch beyond. "Hard to believe what I've heard, that you were a city lady just a year ago, Mrs. Henderson." "Different life," Sarah said simply, "though I use some of those skills still. Those preserves you enjoyed at breakfast, made with techniques I learned presenting fancy conserves in Boston, and our accounts are kept as neatly as any city business," Thomas added with quiet pride. "Sarah's got a head for figures that's improved. Every aspect of the ranch. While Thomas taught me everything about working the land," Sarah said, squeezing his hand, "we learned from each other, built something neither of us could have managed alone." Davis disappeared under his black cloth, making final adjustments. "Hold still now. That's perfect, just as you are." As they waited for the photographer's signal, Sarah thought about all that had happened in 1 year's time. The difficult carving during the winter storm, the garden's first harvest, the slow warming of the community toward them. Montgomery's return and defeat, the gradual, steady growth of their love, built on respect and shared purpose. "What are you thinking?" Thomas whispered. "About all the moments that brought us here. How that day in church, when everything seemed to be falling apart, turned out to be the beginning of everything right," he finished. The camera's shutter clicked, capturing them in that moment of shared understanding. Davis emerged from behind his equipment, smiling. Beautiful, natural as sunrise. Though he hesitated. "Would you mind if I took one more? There's something about how you look at each other." They sat for another portrait, and another, the late afternoon light, casting long shadows across their porch, while Davis enthused about composition and sentiment. But Sarah knew no photograph could truly capture what had grown between them, the deep partnership that had transformed them both, the quiet joy of finding love when and where they least expected it. "I'll have these processed and returned to you within the month," Davis promised as he packed his equipment. "Fine anniversary. Gift, if I do say so myself." After he'd gone, they remained on the porch swing, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their garden lay rich and productive before them, the new wheat field promising in the distance, the orchards tiny but full. Of future promise. "Quite a year," Thomas said softly. "Quite a life," Sarah corrected, resting her head on his shoulder. "And to think it all started with a moment of courage from a quiet man in a back pew. And the dignity of a woman who knew her own worth," Thomas added. Even when others couldn't see it, the swing rocked gently as evening settled around them, their hearts as aligned as their clasped hands. Tomorrow would bring its own work and challenges, but tonight was for remembering, for celebrating the unexpected joy of finding love's truth in life's second chances. The family Bible lay open on the parlor table, its pages illuminated by the warm afternoon sun streaming through spotless windows. Sarah sat beside it, her pen poised over the blank space beneath their wedding date, while Thomas stood behind, her chair, one hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, though she already knew his answer. "As sure as I was about standing up in church that day," he replied softly. "Some things deserve to be written down, remembered." Sarah dipped her pen in ink and began to write in her elegant hand. On this day, 1 year after their marriage, Thomas and Sarah Henderson reaffirmed their commitment to the life they have built together, witnessing that love's truest measure lies not in grand promises, but in daily actions, shared work, and faithful hearts. The words flowed across the page, joining the generations of family history recorded in the Bible's pages. Thomas's parents' marriage, their passing, and now this, not a second wedding ceremony, but a quiet celebration of the love that had grown between two people who had found each other when both had thought their chances for happiness had passed. Outside, they could hear the sounds of their anniversary gathering, the first real celebration they'd hosted on the ranch. The new porch was full of neighbors and friends who had come to share their joy. Mary Preston's laugh carried clearly as she admired Sarah's expanded herb garden, while Jack Preston and other ranchers clustered around Thomas's experimental wheat field, discussing its promising growth. The young schoolteacher, who now boarded with them during the week, was playing with the Preston children in the yard, their happy shouts mixing with the distant lowing of cattle. The smell of Sarah's preserved peaches and fresh-baked bread drifted in from the kitchen, where a group of ranch wives were arranging the anniversary supper. "Listen to that," Thomas said softly. "Remember how quiet the house used to be?" Sarah smiled, touching the words she'd just written. "Life has a way of filling empty spaces when you open your heart to it." She rose and went to the window, Thomas following. From here they could see all they'd built together, the thriving garden, the young orchard, the new wheat field golden in the distance. But more than that, they could see the community they'd helped build, the connections formed, over shared work and mutual respect. "Mary told me something interesting yesterday," Sarah said, watching the scene outside. "Said there's another mail-order bride coming to the territory next month. Younger woman, but scared about what she'll find." Thomas's hand found hers. And I thought we might invite her to stay with us at first, help her find her footing." She turned to face him. "Show her that love can grow in unexpected places if it's rooted in truth, like those volunteer strawberries in your garden," Thomas said with a smile. "Growing stronger for being unexpected." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Davis, the photographer, returning with their anniversary portrait. They gathered around as he unwrapped it carefully. The image captured them exactly as they were. Not a wealthy rancher and his sophisticated wife, but two people who had found in each other something more valuable than social position or material. Success. Their comfort with each other showed in every line of the portrait, in the natural way they leaned toward each other, in the quiet joy of their expressions. "Best work I've done," Davis said proudly. "Already had 3 other couples ask me to take their portraits the same way, natural, on their own porches. You two started something, you know." Sarah thought about that as they hung the portrait in their parlor, about how love could ripple outward, touching other lives in unexpected ways. The young schoolteacher finding a home with them, the mail-order bride who would need guidance, the neighbors who had learned to look past first impressions to see deeper truths. The afternoon passed in a blur of celebration, shared food and stories, children playing, neighbors who had become friends. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across their land, people gathered on the porch to sing hymns. Sarah played the small organ they'd bought with their first preserves profits, while Thomas stood beside her, his voice strong and sure. Later, after the last guest had gone and the house settled into peaceful quiet, they sat together on their porch swing. The evening air was sweet with late summer flowers, and the first stars were appearing above the mountains. "Quite a journey," Thomas said, his arm warm around her shoulders. "And not over yet," Sarah replied, thinking of all they still planned. To build together, the expanding orchard, the new preserves business, the lives they hoped to touch. Inside, the family Bible lay open, their reaffirmation drying on its pages. But the real testament to their love was all around them, in the home they'd built together, in the lives they'd touched, in the quiet strength of 2 hearts that had recognized in each other something true and lasting. "No," Thomas agreed, drawing her closer as night settled over their ranch. "The best journeys never really end. They just keep growing deeper, like roots finding good soil." Sarah smiled, remembering that day in church that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. "Then here's to growing deeper," she said softly, "and to all the unexpected joys still ahead." The porch swing rocked gently as darkness gathered, their hearts as aligned as the stars appearing overhead. They had found in each other not the life either had imagined, but the life they were meant to have, rich with purpose, deep with love, and as true as the ground beneath their feet.